The sky above the eastern edge of the county was still the color of pale ash when he stepped out onto his porch. Not quite dark, not quite morning. That thin hour when the world holds its breath. He stood there a moment with his coffee mug wrapped in both hands, looking east, the way a man looks when he's checking something he already half knows. The horizon was flat and cloudless. It had been flat and cloudless for 11 days running. He set the mug on the rail and pulled on his olive canvas jacket, the one so worn at the elbows it had gone soft as cloth. Then he walked down off the porch steps and into the field. The garden bed ran along the south side of his property, half an acre of worked ground that grew tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, and a short row of sweet corn he'd planted close to the fence. It had been his wife's garden first, years ago, and he had kept it going the way a man keeps something going when letting it go would mean something he wasn't ready to say. He knew every inch of it. He knew the way the soil changed from one end to the other, how the east end caught the worst of the afternoon heat and lost its moisture first, how the roots there always seemed to pull harder and find less. That was where he went this morning, the dry end. He walked the rows slowly, without hurrying, his boots pressing into the earth with each step. The ground cracked along the edges of his footprints. Not soft cracks, hard ones, the kind that opened like old skin and didn't close back. He crouched at the end of one row and pressed 2 fingers into the soil beside a pepper plant. He felt the dryness an inch down, then 2 inches. At 3 inches it was the same. The roots were working, but they were working in dust. He stood back up, slow, the way a man rises when his knees have earned their complaints, and he looked at the sky again. To anyone watching from the fence line, he would have looked like a man doing nothing, just standing there in the gray morning, still and quiet, a weathered silhouette in an old jacket with a face that gave nothing away. But behind that stillness, something was moving. He was adding things up. Days without rain, well depth in July. What he'd watched happen to this particular patch of ground over the last 3 dry summers. What he knew about roots and thirst, and how much patience a living thing can hold before it stops trying. He walked the length of the bed one more time, pressing his boot into the earth every few feet, spacing his steps in a way that looked almost measured. Then he stopped near the middle, where the cracking was worst, and looked down at the ground for a long moment. He'd made up his mind about something. He went inside before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. The house was quiet, the way old houses get, when only one person lives in them. Not empty exactly, but settled, like the rooms had learned to breathe around a single presence, and stopped expecting more. He moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light, just the gray window glow guiding him down the hall to the back bedroom, where he kept things he didn't look at often but never got rid of. The footlocker sat at the foot of the bed, olive green, dented along one corner, with a clasp that had to be lifted at a particular angle or it stuck. He knew the angle without thinking about it. His hands had opened this box hundreds of times, in dozens of different conditions, and they remembered what his mind didn't have to bother with anymore. He lifted the lid. Inside, things were arranged the way a careful man arranges things he respects. Not perfectly, not on display, but intentionally. A folded flag in a corner, a small leather case, some papers wrapped in a rubber band, and underneath the papers, a military field manual, its green cover soft with age, the spine cracked in 3 places, from years of being opened flat. He pulled it out and set it on the bed. The pamphlet was folded inside the back cover, tucked there so long it had taken on the shape of the book. He unfolded it carefully, pressing it flat against the blanket with his palm, the way you'd smooth a letter that had crossed a long distance to reach you. It was a plain thing, 4 pages, printed on thin paper, with small hand-drawn illustrations running along the margins, cross-sections of soil, root systems shown as reaching lines, buried vessel shapes, drawn in simple profile. The title at the top was modest, just a few plain words about water and ground and an old method of keeping one close to the other. He read it slowly. The technique had a name, he said quietly to himself, just once. Ola. The word came from another language, another dry corner of the world, where people had learned the same lesson centuries before anyone thought to write it down. The idea was simple enough to fit in a sentence. Bury an unglazed clay pot in the root zone. Fill it through the neck. Let the porous walls do what porous walls do. No sprinklers, no hoses running in the heat of the day. No water lost to the sun before it ever reached a root. Just slow seeping. Just patient, invisible work happening in the dark, below the surface. He read the words seep and root zone, and no evaporation, and read them again. The drawings showed how deep, how far apart, what size. He looked at the margins where someone, he wasn't sure when, wasn't sure which version of himself, had made 2 small pencil marks beside the spacing diagram. He had read this before. He just hadn't had a reason until now. He slept with the pamphlet on the nightstand and woke before the sun, with the kind of clarity that only comes when a decision has already been made, somewhere below the thinking part of the mind. He dressed in the dark the way he always did, quietly, in order, nothing wasted. The olive canvas jacket went on last. He drank half a cup of coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the yard take shape in the gray early light. The garden still just a dark rectangle beyond the fence. The soil out there dry enough already that it held no dew. He had a number in his head. 24. He'd worked it out the evening before with a stub of pencil on the back of an envelope. The half-acre bed, the spacing from the diagram, 3 feet between pots. The rows staggered so the seep zones overlapped without competing. 24 pots would cover the ground he needed. He folded the envelope and put it in his jacket pocket and didn't look at it again. The number was his. There was a pottery supply shop 2 counties east, past the grain elevator and the county road junction, and another 20 miles of flat farmland. He'd driven past the turnoff before without ever stopping. He stopped now. He made 2 trips. The first load filled the truck bed to the sideboards, 12 pots nested in old feed sacks he'd spread, to keep them from cracking against each other on the road. They were plain and reddish-brown, unglazed, each one roughly the size of a large melon, the neck narrow enough to wrap 3 fingers around. There was nothing decorative about them. They were working objects. He could see that at a glance, the same way he could look at a tool and know it had been made to be used rather than displayed. He paid cash without asking for a receipt, loaded them himself, and drove back on the county road with the windows down and the pots making a low, soft sound behind him, a kind of quiet percussion, each pot speaking lightly against the feed sacks as the truck moved through the shallow dips in the road. He unloaded the first 12 into the barn and drove back the same afternoon for the rest. The man at the shop watched him load the second batch without a word, which suited him fine. He didn't need a conversation. He needed 24 pots, and he had them now, stacked in 2 rows along the barn wall, the reddish clay holding the last of the afternoon light like fired earth does, warm in a way that felt older than the barn itself. He stood for a moment looking at them. There was nothing grand about the sight. 24 plain pots in a row, but there was something solid in it, something that felt like the beginning of a thing done right. He turned off the barn light and walked back to the house, and the evening felt quieter than most, and that was enough. He started on a Tuesday, just after first light, when the ground was still cool enough to work without the soil fighting back. He brought the pots out from the barn in the wheelbarrow, 6 at a time, setting them at the edge of the garden bed where the earth ran driest, the eastern strip that never held moisture long, the ground that cracked first every summer and cracked deepest. He had already measured the rows with a length of twine, knotting it at every 3 feet, staking it low to the ground so the intervals stayed true. Old habit. Do the measuring before you start. Fix the line and trust it. He dug with a long-handled spade, opening each hole wide enough to sink the pot cleanly, deep enough that only the neck would clear the surface. The clay pots were roughly the size of a large melon, reddish-brown, and slightly rough to the touch, unglazed, the kind of vessel that felt honest about what it was. He settled the first one in, pressed the earth back around it with his boot heel, and tamped it firm with the flat of the spade, then stepped 3 feet along the twine and started again. By mid-morning, he had 6 pots buried, their open mouths sitting just above the soil line like small, quiet openings waiting for something. He stood up straight, worked the stiffness from his lower back, and drank from the canteen he'd left at the end of the row. The sky was clear and pale, and already beginning to press heat down into the field. That was when the voice came from the fence line. The younger man who farmed the adjacent land was standing with his forearms resting on the top rail, watching. He had been there for a few minutes at least, long enough to have formed an opinion. He called over and asked what exactly was going in the ground. His tone was the kind that carries its own answer already built in, not a question looking for information, more a question making a point. The veteran walked to the row's end, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, and explained it simply. Buried pots, unglazed clay. You fill them through the mouth. The water seeps through the walls slow, goes straight to the roots. No runoff, no evaporation. An old way of doing it. Works in dry ground. He said it without embellishment, the way a man describes a tool he's used and trusts. The neighbor was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was close enough, and said something about water going into the dirt being what rain was for, and walked back toward his own field, shaking his head as he went. The veteran watched him go for just a moment, then turned back to the row, set the spade into the earth, and opened the next hole. 7 down, 17 to go. The morning was still long. Word travels fast in a small county. It doesn't need a telephone or a newspaper. It needs one person who finds something funny, and the rest follows on its own. By the time the veteran made his next trip to the feed store, the story of the buried jars had already arrived there before him. He pulled the old truck into the gravel lot on a Tuesday morning, the tailgate rope still tied the same way it had been for 3 years, and walked in through the screen door the way he always did, unhurried, with a short list folded in his shirt pocket. The store smelled the way it always did, mineral salt and old wood, and something faintly metallic from the bins along the far wall. He heard the laughter before he reached the counter. Not at him, not exactly. More around him. The way a room holds a joke that's already been told and is still warm. 2 men were standing near the register, a third leaning against the end of the shelving, and one of them was doing something with his hands, mining with an imaginary tool, slow and ceremonial, his back bent in an exaggerated stoop. He was saying something about an old man who'd decided to bury his drinking glasses in the garden and call it farming. The other men were laughing. Not cruelly, he might have said, if asked, just easily. The way men laugh at something that costs them nothing. The veteran set his list on the counter. He noted the impression, the bent back, the pantomimed digging, the way the man paused just slightly when he noticed the screen door had opened. Not long enough to stop, just long enough to make sure the timing was right. He bought what he came for, 40 pounds of bone meal, a replacement washer for the hand pump, 2 rolls of baling twine. He counted out the bills from his wallet and folded the receipt into his shirt pocket beside the list. He said almost nothing, a word about the pump washer size, a nod to confirm the bone meal weight. That was the extent of it. What he did not say was this, that the man doing the impression had lost a full row of peppers to dry soil 2 summers prior, and had spent the rest of that August complaining about it at this same counter. That the laughter was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when they haven't been tested yet. That a joke about a hole in the ground is easy to make in June, when the sky is still blue and no one is thirsty. He loaded the truck alone and drove home on the county road with the windows down. What he noticed, mostly, was the quality of the air. Hot already, even before noon. The kind of heat that doesn't apologize. The grass along the ditches had begun to look pale at the tips. He filed that away too. He started before the sun had cleared the tree line. The tin pitcher had been his wife's, used for lemonade on the porch through summers he no longer counted out loud. It held about a gallon, maybe a little less, and it had a small dent near the base, where it had been dropped once on the kitchen floor. He filled it at the hand pump and carried it to the first pot in the row. The mouth of the pot sat just above the soil line, a dark reddish circle, no wider than a man's fist spread open. He set the pitcher's lip against it and poured slowly, watching the water disappear into the clay. Not the way water disappears into open ground, rushing and spreading and already half lost to the air. It went in clean and deliberate, and the pot accepted it the way something accepts what it was made for. He moved to the second pot, then the third. There was no sound except the pour of water and the early insects, and, somewhere past the fence, a meadowlark working through its song twice and then stopping. The light came sideways across the garden, long and golden and not yet cruel. By the time it turned cruel, he intended to be finished. Each pot took the water without complaint. He refilled the pitcher at the pump between rows, counting his trips without thinking about the count, the way a man counts his steps going up a familiar staircase. 12 pots on the first row, 12 on the second, 24 in total, each one set into its hole at exactly the depth he had measured, with a length of stick he'd marked with a notch. Neck deep, so the body of the pot sat entirely underground, only the mouth showing. It had taken most of a week to dig the holes properly. Digging in dry soil takes patience, because dry soil does not want to give. What happened inside the pots, no one watching could have seen. The walls of unglazed terracotta are not truly solid. Under a magnifying glass, they would look more like pressed earth than stone, and that is close to what they are. Water finds the spaces between the particles and moves through them the way water always moves, toward dry, toward need. It doesn't rush. It seeps in the truest sense of that word. Slowly enough that the soil around each pot receives moisture without becoming saturated, without losing what it's given to the surface air. His roots did not know this yet. They were where they were, reaching the way roots reach, without opinion about what they would find. But the pots knew their part. The clay had been doing this work, in one form or another, since long before anyone in this county had thought to build a fence or plant a field. He had just asked them to do it again. He emptied the last pitcher into the last pot, straightened up slowly, and stood there a moment in the warming air. He stood there only a moment, long enough to let his back settle, long enough to feel the morning warming against his forearms. Then he picked up the pitcher and the empty bucket and walked back to the house. That was how the weeks began. There is a kind of watching that doesn't announce itself. It isn't dramatic. It happens the way breathing happens, automatically, built into the rhythm of everything else. Every morning he moved through the garden the same way, along the same rows, and every morning his first 2 fingers went into the earth, beside one pot, then another, pressing down to the second knuckle, reading what was there. Soil is an honest thing. It doesn't lie about what it's holding or what it needs. Under his fingers, the ground beside each buried pot was consistently different from the ground a foot away. Cooler, slightly firmer, a texture that meant water was present, even when the surface looked like dust. He didn't celebrate this. He just noted it and moved on. The plants themselves were beginning to say the same thing. It was subtle enough that a person walking past would have missed it. The pepper plants above the buried pots were a shade deeper in their green. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make anyone stop and point. But he had been looking at plants long enough to know that color is a form of information, and the information those plants were giving was good. The tomato vines above the pot rows were a knuckle or two taller than their neighbors in the older surface-watered beds. A little more upright in the heat of the afternoon, when everything in the garden was inclined to droop. He watered the pots every few days, carrying the pitcher out in the early morning, filling each one through its open mouth, and watching the water disappear below the neck. It took less water than surface irrigation ever had. That fact settled in him quietly, the way important things do. The well ran low every dry summer, and he had always rationed carefully, always felt the tightness of a dry July pulling against his supply. This summer the gauge on his hand pump was holding, not rising, but holding. Above the garden the sky was doing something he had been watching for weeks. The blue was losing its depth. It was still blue, but the way a fire goes pale when the wood runs low, the sky was showing less. The clouds that appeared in the late afternoon were thin and vague, and passed without leaving anything. The air smelled dry the way old paper smells dry. The creek at the county road had gone quiet. He had crossed it twice in the last week, and both times the stones were showing where they hadn't shown in June. He said nothing to anyone about any of this. He just kept filling the pots, kept pressing 2 fingers into the earth each morning, kept watching the pale sky stretch itself wider over the county, like a sheet pulled tight across a frame. July came in without ceremony. No thunderstorm to mark the turning of the month, no morning mist rising off the low fields, no green smell in the air that usually followed a good June rain. July simply arrived the way a door closes in an empty house, quietly, finally, with a weight that settled into the walls. He heard the advisory on the AM radio while he was eating breakfast before first light. The announcer's voice had that particular flatness that weather reports take on when the news is not good, and the station knows it has to say it plainly. Drought conditions developing across the eastern county. Rainfall totals at 30% of seasonal average. Farmers advised to conserve. He set down his fork and listened to the rest of it. Then he rinsed his plate, pulled on his canvas jacket against the early chill, and went out to the garden. He filled each pot the same way he had been filling them since May, one at a time, patient and unhurried. He could see the neighboring field from where he worked. The younger farmer had put in a good stand of squash along his eastern fence, and through the weeks of June, it had spread and leafed and looked like ambition made visible. Now the broad leaves were beginning to fold inward at the edges, curling slightly the way a page curls near heat. Not dead, not yet, but leaning that direction. The soil between the rows had a pale, powdery look to it, the kind of look that comes when the top 2 inches turn to dust and the crust beneath it hardens. Down the county road, where a family had planted sweet corn in the low strip beside the ditch, the stalks were still standing, but the leaves had gone from bright to faded, that particular yellow-green that meant the plant was spending more than it was receiving. By August, if the sky stayed pale and dry, those ears would never fill out properly. The feed store men were not laughing about anything now. He had driven past on a Tuesday for a bag of lime, and the group that usually gathered on the wooden bench outside had the look of men sitting with a problem they couldn't put down. They talked in low voices. One of them had a son with dryland beans. Another had leased a field to a young couple planting peppers for the first time. The conversations at the bench had turned from jokes to arithmetic, from amusement to worry, the way summer conversations always eventually do, when the rain stops long enough to matter. He nodded as he passed. They nodded back. No one said anything about clay pots. He loaded his lime and drove home and went back to the garden. The mouths of the pots sat level with the soil, each one waiting. He knelt beside the nearest row and pressed 2 fingers into the earth between the second and third pot. Cool, damp, exactly what it needed to be. He moved to the next row and did the same. The creek had been dry for 11 days. He knew the exact count because he had walked down to check it every morning, the way a man checks on something he cannot help. not hoping exactly, but wanting to mark the truth of it honestly. On the 11th morning, he stood on the cracked mud that had been moving water in June, and looked at the pale line it left in the field, a shallow depression running between the trees like the memory of a creek rather than the thing itself. The cottonwood roots along the bank were pulling hard for anything left underground. He could see it in the curl of the leaves. The fence posts along the south row had begun to gap at the soil line where the earth had pulled back from them, shrinking as it dried. Old cedar posts, set 30 years ago or more, and the ground was leaving them. He walked the fence one afternoon, tapping each post with his boot, checking for lean. Most held, but the soil around them had cracked into plates, the kind of cracking that happened after sustained heat, with no recovery. The kind the old-timers called hardpan weather, because if it went long enough, the ground would seal itself and shed what little rain came rather than drink it. His garden held a different color. It was subtle from a distance, but up close it was undeniable. A sustained, breathing green that did not match the browns collecting everywhere else. He was filling the second row of pots in the early evening, carrying water from the pump in 2-gallon jugs the way he always did, moving slowly, pouring steadily, when he heard the sound of boots on dry grass from the neighboring field. He looked up. The younger farmer was leaning on the fence, not with his arms crossed, the way he had stood in spring. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the top rail, looking into the garden with an expression that had changed entirely. There was no amusement in it. There was no performance. He was simply looking, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand before he has to say anything about it. They stood like that for a moment without speaking. The veteran set down his jugs, walked to the pump, and filled a tin cup. He carried it to the fence and held it over the rail without a word. The younger man took it and drank. He handed it back. He looked at the garden again, at the rows, at the small clay mouths sitting level in the soil, at the green that shouldn't have been there. The sun was dropping behind the tree line. The light came across the field in long, flat angles, and the garden caught it and held it in a way the surrounding ground no longer could. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. The tomatoes came red in the first week of August. Not all at once. They came the way good things tend to come when you have waited for them honestly. 1 or 2 at a time, then a cluster, then a weight across the whole row that made the cages lean just slightly with the load. He walked the bed each morning in the gray light before the sun had any heat in it, turning each tomato gently in his palm, checking the shoulders, checking the skin. When one was ready, he set it in the crate without ceremony. When one needed another day, he let it have it. The peppers had filled out thick and smooth, their skins taut and glossy, even in air that had grown thin and hot and still. The squash hung heavy from their runners, the kind of heavy that means the soil below never quit. He had to lift the leaves to find them all, and sometimes he was surprised by the size. Big, pale green ovals resting in the dust, like something the earth had been quietly saving up. The bean rows were still upright. That was the thing that stayed with him in a quiet way, every time he walked past them. Every other bean planting in the county had gone to wire by now, brittle, yellow, finished. His stood the way bean rows are supposed to stand in July, before July turns cruel. They stood like they hadn't heard the news. He picked in the early morning. He moved without hurry, without any feeling that he was rushing to prove something, because he wasn't. This was simply work. Crate after crate, he set at the end of each row, and when the crates were full, he carried them 2 at a time to the tailgate of the old pickup, stacking them with care so the tomatoes wouldn't bruise against each other on the county road. He covered the load with an old canvas tarp, not to hide anything, but to keep the morning cool in the crates a little longer. By the time the sun was fully up, he had the truck loaded. He stood for a moment with his hands resting on the side panel, looking at the crates. 24 clay pots buried in rows. half an acre of ground that everyone who drove past had written off in their minds weeks ago. And here were the crates, full, stacked, waiting. He went inside and washed his hands at the kitchen sink. He poured the last of the morning coffee into a travel cup, screwed on the lid, and picked up his wallet from the counter. He put on his olive canvas jacket even in the heat, the way he always did when he was going somewhere that required a certain amount of dignity. Then he got in the truck and drove toward town, the crates of vegetables riding quiet and heavy in the bed behind him. The market ran along the shaded side of the feed store parking lot on Saturday mornings. 6 or 7 folding tables set up under a long canvas awning the county had owned since the 70s. Normally by mid-July, those tables would be crowded with summer produce, cucumbers in paper bags, ears of corn in their husks, squash laid out in rows, jars of preserves catching the light. But when the veteran pulled his old pickup into the gravel lot that morning and began unloading his crates, most of the other tables held only jarred goods, dried herbs, and a few baskets of early apples that had come off stressed trees and showed it. The woman who ran the market exchange met him at the tailgate. She had a clipboard and a habit of moving quickly, and she slowed down when she saw what was in the crates. She lifted the canvas tarp and stood looking for a moment without saying anything. The tomatoes were deep red, heavy, their skins uncracked. The peppers were smooth and full. The squash was firm, the beans still bright. She set her clipboard against her hip and looked at him, and then looked at the crates again. She gave him a table near the center. He set out his produce the same way he did everything, without hurry, without performance. He stacked the tomatoes carefully, laid the peppers in rows, arranged the squash and the beans in the wooden crates he'd brought from the barn. He put a handwritten price card at the front of each section, the numbers in plain block letters, with a black marker. People came. Not quickly at first, but steadily, the way water finds a path through stone. A woman with a grocery bag over one arm stopped and picked up a tomato and turned it over in her hands. She bought 6. A man in a seed company cap came over and bought 2 bags of peppers without asking the price. By 9 o'clock, there was a short line. The woman with the clipboard stood back near the awning post and watched it with her arms folded, not saying a word. The man from the feed store arrived a little after 10. He had his hands in his pockets, and he walked the length of the market awning at a deliberate pace, the way a man does when he is looking for something, but doesn't want anyone to know he's looking. He stopped at the veteran's table. He looked at the tomatoes for a long moment. Then he picked up a paper bag and filled it himself, choosing each tomato with some care, and he set the bag on the table and counted out the right amount of money from his wallet and laid it next to the price card. He did not make eye contact. He said nothing about pots or pamphlets or foolishness. The veteran thanked him the same way he thanked everyone else that morning, quietly, without emphasis, looking him straight in the face. The crates were empty before noon. He was loading the last empty crates into the truck bed when the feed store man came back. The market was quieting down by then. The other vendors were counting their cash and folding their tables. A few people lingered near the far end of the awning, but mostly, the lot was emptying out into the flat noon heat, and the veteran was working alone the way he usually did, stacking wood and canvas with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. The feed store man walked up and stood a few feet back. He had his cap in his hands now, turning it slowly by the brim. The veteran looked up, nodded once, and kept stacking. The man cleared his throat. He looked at the truck bed. He looked at the gravel. Then he said it plain, without ornament, the way a man speaks when he has decided he is done being proud about something. He asked how it worked. The veteran set down the crate he was holding. He reached into the truck bed and picked up one of the spare pots he had brought along. Reddish-brown, unglazed, roughly the size of a large melon, the plain, ordinary thing it had always been. He turned it once in his hands. Then he held it out. The feed store man took it, feeling the weight of it, the rough, dry surface of the clay. The veteran said, quietly, and without any performance in his voice, "She holds what the sky won't give." The man looked at the pot. He ran his thumb along the side of it, and you could see him working something out, turning the idea over, the way you turn a new tool in your hand, before you understand its use. He didn't say anything else. He gave a single slow nod. He set the pot carefully on the tailgate, like it was worth something, which by then he understood that it was, and he walked back to his truck. The veteran watched him go. Then he picked up the pot, wrapped it in the old feed sack he used for padding, tucked it in behind the driver's seat, and drove home. He ate a quiet supper. He washed his plate and left it to dry. He went to bed early, the way he always did when there was work planned for morning. He was in the field before first light. The shovel went in steady, the same rhythm as always: lift, turn, clear, move on. The earth was dry, and it gave back a pale dust when he broke it, and the sky above him was still dark at the edges and going gray toward the east. And he worked without hurrying, measuring the spacing by feel, the way a man does when he has done a thing enough times that the knowing has moved down into his hands. 24 holes this year. He would dig more next spring.